Islam Makhachev versus Alexander Volkanovski is finally here. So let's get into this one and break this one down. Who will win? Who will take home the lightweight title? Will Volk be a double champ, or will Islam continue his reign? Now, before I start, if I sound a little congested or nasally, like I'm talking through my nose, it's because I've had a cold here for a couple weeks that I just can't seem to shake. But hey, there's higher priorities here. We got a great fight coming up, and so let's go ahead and dive into this one. Now, if you didn't see my previous video where I broke down Islam versus Charles before and after their fight, make sure you watch that video because that will be a really in-depth look at Islam's game. And for this fight, I think the more important question here isn't really can Islam beat Volk. I think it's can Volk beat Islam. So because of that, I want to focus more on Volkanovski's previous fights and his strengths and weaknesses and how they match up against Islam. Now, the challenging part about analyzing this fight is looking at Volkanovski's fight history and trying to think of an opponent that resembles Islam. You know, who can resemble Islam's style the best in a division that has a ton of strikers and not necessarily a ton of very dominant grapplers, or at least in recent years. Now, I did come up with two of Volkanovski's opponents that do resemble some of the strengths that Islam presents, but I also wanted to go back to the beginning of his UFC fight history and work our way forward to see if there's anything that stands out. And what I mean by stand out is, are there any tendencies when fighting against grapplers or southpaws specifically that may give us a hint of how this fight will go against Islam? Now, the interesting thing when looking at Volkanovski's fight history is that he's had 12 fights in the UFC, but only 2 of those have come against southpaws. Also, one of those fights, his debut, was at 155 pounds, with the rest being at 145 pounds or featherweight. Now, in his debut against Yusuke Kasuya, that was one of the southpaw fights that he had, and it also ironically was at 155 pounds. Now, this was ultimately a fight that Volkanovski finished and dominated, but in the fight, he did display a few tendencies against a grappler that wasn't so great. There was a point in the fight where Volkanovski, exhibited his usual pressure, pushing the fighter towards the fence, and he was caught with a takedown as he pressed him with strikes. He also got swept with a leg lock attempt and wasn't able to get back up until Kasuya went for a submission attempt that got a bit sloppy and allowed Volk to capitalize on it. Now, if he didn't go for that submission attempt, I don't know if Volkanovski would have gotten back up for the rest of the round because he wasn't able to before that. Now, I understand this fight was in 2016 and it was a while ago, and Volk has gotten leaps and bounds better, and he's, obviously a champion now, but it is worth noting some of these tendencies as we go forward because you'll see some of them repeat themselves. Now, again, Volkanovski did finish this fight and he finished it on the ground, but he did show a tendency to be taken down when clinched and also to end up in the clinch and then end up being taken down himself when pressuring in with strikes, which is obviously a staple of his style that we've seen for years now. Now, a year later, Volkanovski had a catchweight fight against Shane Young, and in this fight he had a different game plan. This time he was going to press the takedowns, and he attempted 14 but only landed 5. He dominated this fight as well, but there was a couple moments in this fight that, again, when analyzing his style against Islam's, didn't really look that great to me. He was pressing in again against Shane Young, throwing strikes against the fence, and Shane Young was able to take him down. Also, during a scramble, Volkanovski left his arm out there and Shane Young went for a Kimura attempt and he wasn't able to get it. But when you look at things like this, you have to wonder, could Islam capitalize on something like that? And personally, I would say yes. Now, a year later, he fought Darren Elkins, and in this fight, he had a lot of takedown attempts as well. He shot 12 takedown attempts, but only landed 2, but still landed 100 significant strikes in there. He was mixing it up a lot of takedown attempts, landing a lot of bombs, high volume strikes, typical Volkanovski stuff that we see. Although, in some of these older fights, he was definitely more takedown heavy than he is these days. Now, again, Volkanovski dominated this fight, but there was a moment in this fight where against the fence, Darren Elkins was able to get a dominant clinch position and attempt a trip. Now, he didn't hit it, but he was able to reverse the clinch position on Volkanovski, and it's one of those positions again where if you picture Islam in the same scenario, I can't help but picture him getting the takedown. Another thing that stood out to me in this fight is that Volkanovski went for an odd amount of guillotines in this fight. He attempted 4, I believe, and some of them ended up getting him in a bad spot. He didn't complete any of them. He didn't win this fight by submission, but his tendency to shoot for that guillotine a lot in these clinch scenarios, in these grappling scenarios, or when defending a takedown was a bit alarming to me, because the guillotine can be one of those moves moves that fighters instinctively go for when someone's deep in on a shot. You know, we saw it with Khabib shooting takedowns on Dustin Poirier and him going for the guillotine, you know, and we've seen it with countless other fighters. And it can be one of those reflexive movements that you do when the fighter is in deep on a shot. And, you know, seeing him go for that so many times in this fight made me wonder, you know, would he potentially go for that if Islam got deep in on a shot on him? And if so, it could potentially put him in an even worse position than if he defended the shot another way. Now, of course, Darren Elkins, completely different fighter from Islam Makhachev, and maybe Volkanovski just didn't respect his grappling. But again, Elkins does have a wrestling background, and it does mean something. You can't completely disrespect your opponents, obviously, in the UFC. And I don't think Volkanovski disrespects anyone necessarily either. So, you know, with that considered, all these guillotine attempts, a little bit alarming. Getting reversed in that clinch, definitely alarming. And just something to note as we continue to go along here and analyze some of these tendencies in these grappling scenarios. Now, jumping ahead another year to 2019, when Volkanovski fought Jose Aldo, this was mostly a striking battle between these two. Volkanovski landed something like 95 significant strikes and attempted around 170 to 180. So again, mostly trading strikes with very little grappling. Now, even though this was a very striking heavy fight, there were multiple occasions where they did engage in the clinch, with Volkanovski initiating it. And there was a specific point in round 2 where Volkanovski gets reversed with a body lock and Jose Aldo attempts a trip, which exposes Volkanovski's back. So again, we're seeing that tendency to not only engage in the clinch, but potentially get reversed and put in bad positions where someone like Islam could really counter and take advantage of these spots. Now, earlier in the video, I said that there were 2 opponents specifically I felt that could best imitate some of the strengths of Islam. And although they're not perfect matches, they're about as close as we can get in terms of Volkanovski's opponent history. And those 2 opponents are Chad Mendes and Brian Ortega. So going back to 2018, when Volkanovski fought Chad Mendes, this was an interesting fight because Chad Mendes up to that point was probably the best grappler that Volkanovski had faced. Certainly one of the biggest athletic freaks we've ever had in the UFC and one of the most explosive double legs there's ever been in the featherweight division. Now, this fight was mostly a striking match, but Chad Mendes did land 3 or 4 takedowns on Volkanovski. In round 1, we saw more of the tendencies that we had seen in the past with Volkanovski when he pressured in against Chad Mendes, pushing him towards the fence, and Mendes ducked underneath and shot a double leg and took him down fairly easily. Now, in round 2, Mendes had multiple strong moments in this fight. He knocked down Volkanovski with a strike as Volkanovski was pushing in, and then about a minute later, when Volkanovski's pressuring in, he ducks underneath it, locks up a body lock, and gets a takedown. And then another minute later in round 2, Mendes shoots, Volkanovski reacts thinking it's a strike coming in, and Mendes is able to land the double leg and expose Volkanovski's back. Now, eventually Volkanovski ended up finishing this fight, but I think it was mainly because Mendes started to wilt. You know, all that wrestling, his explosive power, and also, of course, taking damage from Volkanovski really started to wilt his gas tank and drain that gas tank. And Volkanovski's conditioning is just second to none, as we've seen. And Volkanovski's also just incredibly tough himself. So he's able to weather the storm. He was able to keep up a better pace and have better conditioning and finish Mendes. But again, we've seen these tendencies now a few times to where when Volkanovski's pressing in, he can get taken down and he can potentially be countered with strikes as well. And just taken down in general, you know, if an opponent has good grappling, good feints, and good takedown setups. Now, jumping ahead a few years later to the Brian Ortega fight in 2021, this was a fight that Volk landed an incredible amount of strikes in, somewhere, you know, over 200 significant strikes landed in this fight. And he dominated this fight, but not without some very, very dangerous moments mixed in. Now, the interesting thing about this fight is that Ortega was the second southpaw that Volkanovski has fought in the UFC, and Ortega also landed 2 of 5 takedowns in this fight. You know, when looking back on this fight, at least in my memory, I think about it just Volkanovski completely dominating Ortega most of this fight, and you know, except for those 2 submission attempts, the triangle and the mounted guillotine, which really had him in danger. But you know, off the top of my head, I really just remember Volkanovski just crushing Ortega for the majority of this fight. But when I went back and watched it, that wasn't entirely true, and Ortega had more moments than I remembered. Now, one of the most interesting moments in this fight was when Ortega did go for that mounted guillotine and the way he initiated it. Ortega was actually in the southpaw stance and caught a leg kick and countered with a strike that stunned Volkanovski badly and allowed Ortega to jump on the submission attempt. Now, this is a very interesting moment to me because Volkanovski has not faced very many southpaws, and Islam is a counter striker, or primarily a counter striker. Again, if you go watch the previous videos that I've done on him, you'll see some of the counter striking that I've highlighted with him. And he can fight going forward or going back, but in general, Islam will counter, and he's very quick at countering, especially with his hands. So when I saw this, I could easily see Volk ending up in the same position against Islam and potentially having a leg kick caught, or some other counter happening where Islam hits him with a left straight and is able to knock him down the same way Ortega did. Now, furthermore, once Ortega was on the ground with him and Volk survived that mounted guillotine, which by the way is absolutely incredible. Surviving a mounted guillotine like that is just really mind-blowing, especially from someone as high level as Ortega, because not only is the guillotine choking you and shutting off the blood, but the mounted guillotine especially is extremely painful. And this is a real testament to how tough Volkanovski is, and that's something that can't be ignored here either. But anyway, after the mounted guillotine attempt, Ortega had Volkanovski on his back and top half, and he ended up going for a Darce choke, which allowed Volkanovski to come up. Now again, if you've watched my previous videos about Islam's style, he prefers to be in top half a lot, and we saw it against Charles Oliveira even recently, and that is really a dominant position for him. So if he was able to get Volk in that same top half position and not necessarily go for a Darce choke that allows a potential opening, it makes me think, how long would Volk be stuck there against Islam, and would he eventually be caught in a submission himself? Now later on again in the fight against Ortega in round 4, we see Volkanovski exhibit some of his tendencies that we've talked about previously. Volkanovski presses in against Ortega against the fence, Ortega ducks underneath it and locks up a body lock and is able to hit a trip and get the takedown. So now obviously that type of scenario against the fence and ducking underneath and getting body locks and countering with trips is right up Islam's alley, and that is Islam's game 101 on the fence. That is one of his strengths. So when we've seen this repeatedly over the course of years and throughout Volkanovski's improvement from the time he made his debut to the time he was a champion, it is a bit alarming to me, and it is a potential weakness, and a pretty large weakness that somebody like Islam can definitely exploit as the larger fighter and as the fighter who is absolutely deadly in the clinch, as we know. And going back to that knockdown that Ortega landed on him, we've seen Islam counter and land takedowns of his own. Against Dan Hooker, Dan Hooker threw a leg kick that got him countered and taken down and eventually led to the end of the fight pretty quickly from there. Also, when Islam ended up finishing Oliveira, it came from Oliveira throwing a knee and getting countered with a strike that knocked him down and led to the arm triangle. So as we've seen, Islam is definitely capable of counter-striking and knocking down a fighter that presses in on him and finishing the fight, or at least keeping the fight on the ground to where that fighter loses the round against him. Now, so far in this video, I've mainly highlighted the potential vulnerabilities of Volkanovski against Islam, but there is something I want to mention here about these champ versus champ fights. We haven't seen many of them. There's only been 6, and this will be the 7th one to occur in UFC history. And there's an interesting statistic if you look at the previous fights. In 4 of the 6 champion versus champion super fights that we've seen, the lighter fighter coming up in weight has actually won the fight. And not only that, all 4 of those lighter fighters coming up won by KO or TKO and finished the fight against the heavier fighter. So just off the results and stats alone of past super fights, maybe Volkanovski has a better chance than we think, and maybe he'll even finish it. Now the downside when looking at those 6 super fights is what happened in the other 2, and that's when the heavier fighter won. And both of those fighters, GSP and Jan Blachowicz, ended up winning with grappling-based game plans. Now, I realize that they weren't entirely grappling-based, as Jan had a striking match with Adesanya for a lot of that fight, but he did start landing takedowns that shifted the momentum of that fight pretty heavily and sealed him the victory. And GSP, of course, did plenty of striking as well against BJ Penn, but his takedowns and ground and pound really put a stamp on that fight and ended up wilting BJ to the point where he couldn't continue anymore. Also worth noting is that the 4 fighters that lost by KO and TKO against the lighter fighter were fighters that had striking-based game plans. So while on one hand, the results of past super fights have favored the lighter fighter, in this case, when considering Islam's style and his heavily grappling-based style, it may not favor Volk in the same way, and it may go the way of the other 2 fights with Jan and GSP, and maybe even more so, depending on how much grappling Islam plans to use in this fight. And I assume Islam, of course, has plenty of grappling in the game plan against Volkanovski as the larger fighter, and the fighter who's obviously had a vast majority of his wins come from his dominant grappling abilities. Now, there's one more thing I want to note here about Islam's grappling ability, and I think it's important to this fight because Volkanovski has a high striking output in most of his his fights. So because of that, it made me curious to what happens to Islam's opponent's striking output when they face Islam versus their career averages. Now, instead of analyzing every opponent in Islam's career, I wanted to just simply take his last 5 opponents in the UFC and see what their average significant strikes landed per minute were in their career, and then see what happened to that average when they faced Islam. So I did a little bit of math, looked up their stats, and here's what I found. Now, in Charles Oliveira's career, his average significant strikes landed per minute is 3.48. But when he fought Islam, that dropped to 2.34, a decline of 33%, and he landed 19 significant strikes overall. In Bobby Green's career, he has an average of 5.99 significant strikes landed per minute, but when he fought Islam, that declined to 2.8, a 53% drop, and he only landed 9 in their fight. Dan Hooker averaged 4.83, but against Islam, only 1.8, a decline of 63%, and he only landed 4. Thiago Moises averaged 2.47 in his career, but against Islam, only 1.32, a decline of 46%, and he only landed 13 significant strikes in their fight. Lastly, Drew Dober averaged 4.47 significant strikes per minute in his career, but against Islam, it dropped to 0.9, an 80% decline, and he only landed 10. When taking the average of these last 5 fights, on average, when an opponent fights Islam, their significant strikes landed per minute output drops by an average of 55%. This is obviously a tremendous fall off and a testament to how dominant Islam's control is, especially in the grappling. He completely saps these guys whether they're high output strikers or not, and their striking stats really just fall off a cliff. He does not get hit much, and these guys don't even get very many attempts to hit him. As a side note, an interesting stat here I noticed when I looked at these numbers is that the combined significant strikes of Islam's last 5 opponents, which is 55 significant strikes, is nearly equivalent to the 50 significant strikes Volkanovski landed in the 5th round alone against Max Holloway. So that obviously tells us 2 things. Number 1, Volkanovski has an incredibly high striking output when he's on point and dominating a fight, and it also tells us that Islam is able to really neutralize the striking output of his opponents. Now, I think Volkanovski's chances of winning this fight go up as the fight goes on. If he's able to make it out of those first couple of rounds, I think his chances of winning go up dramatically. And in the Max Holloway fight, we actually saw his accuracy continue to go up as the fight went on. Now, of course, Max Holloway is a completely different fighter than Islam, and this is a totally different style matchup, and as they say, styles make fights. But I do think that Volkanovski's best chance of winning this fight is at range, sticking and moving, and dragging this fight out round after round to a decision win. However, I do think that overall Islam wins this fight because I think that what Volk does best plays perfectly into what Islam does best. I think that Volk's strengths play perfectly into Islam's strengths, which essentially makes Volkanovski's strengths his weaknesses. And that really is the problem for a lot of guys fighting Islam. You know, if they're high output strikers, Islam has an incredible ability to neutralize those strikes and make it seem like the guy is just simply fighting in quicksand and slowly dissolving over time until Islam takes advantage and finishes the fight. And again, going back to the fact that Volkanovski has only faced 2 southpaws in his career, that's going to be a significant issue here. He's been beating these high-level guys in the featherweight division, which is amazing, of course, but they've been orthodox fighters with a very different fighting style from Islam, and none of them have presented the grappling threat in the way that Islam does. Of course, Ortega has incredible submissions, and he may be the best opportunist in the division because of that, but he doesn't have the same wrestling and control and diverse takedown game that Islam has in the clinch or at range. Islam just has so many ways of taking a guy down that I don't see how Volkanovski avoids the clinch entirely in this fight. And as we've seen in Volkanovski's previous fights, he has a tendency to end up in the clinch one way or another, whether it's out in the open or against the fence, because at some point Volkanovski's going to have to push in. He can't just back up the whole time and counter strike and win the fight. He is going to have to engage, and when he does engage, he's at risk of being countered either with body locks, duck unders to takedowns, being pushed against the fence and losing that over-under battle, or, you know, one of the other many ways that Islam has to get the takedown and get guys on the ground. And speaking of the fence, I think that's a big issue here because Volkanovski in a lot of his fights ends up pressuring guys towards the fence and throwing a lot of volume as he backs them up. He's good at cutting off the cage and getting guys stuck against the fence and making them absorb shots. But again, ending up on the fence against Islam is the last place you want to be. And Islam isn't just going to sit there and be a sitting duck and absorb strikes. He's going to get the clinch somehow, some way, and Volkanovski's going to have to deal with that. And I don't think he's going to be able to defend the takedowns. And we've even seen Volk say that, you know, essentially he believes that he'll probably get taken down at some point in this fight, but he will be able to get back up. Now, I don't know how reliable that is because Islam's control is ridiculous. And the problem with getting back up is getting back up usually means opening yourself up for submission attempts. And Islam himself, like Brian Ortega, is a great opportunist as well and very fast. And lastly, to conclude this video, we just saw an orthodox fighter who is a champion in Charles Oliveira against Islam, and look what Islam did to him. Obviously, they have Volkanovski and Oliveira have two very different styles, but Oliveira was the best of the best in the division, and he has an extremely high finish rate. He's got the submission record, and he's a very dangerous striker, but look what Islam did to him. He made it look easy in a lot of ways. And now we have an orthodox fighter coming up from a smaller weight class, and we expect him to defeat Islam. It's a bit of a reach to me, but of course anything is possible. Volkanovski's a champion for a reason, and his toughness is incredible. Maybe he'll ride out some submission attempts or some of these strikes and, you know, and end up fatiguing Islam and taking the fight that way. We don't know. But overall, if I had to pick a fighter in this, I would pick Islam to win, and I think he may even finish this fight in a couple of rounds just with his submission acumen and his ability to put guys in really bad spots to where they suddenly get caught out of nowhere in submissions. And he also is very good at chaining takedowns into submissions. He can hit a throw or a trip or a takedown into a position that exposes an arm or something like that, and the guy doesn't realize it and ends up in a submission attempt out of nowhere while he's still defending the takedown. So Islam is very disorienting in that way, and he can chain things into submissions very quickly. So overall, I think Islam wins this fight. But is Volkanovski completely hopeless? I don't think so. He's a champion for a reason, and there are ways for him to win, but I think it is in the sense that if he can stick and move and keep Islam away and survive the grappling exchanges, that is when his chances of winning go up. But I just don't see him surviving enough of those clinching exchanges to make it out of this fight. And I think Islam most likely gets the finish at some point in the grappling. But it's also worth noting that Islam's counter-striking is more dangerous than people realize. And I think people are starting to probably wake up to it a little bit after that Charles Oliveira fight. And even though Oliveira does get knocked down in the majority of his fights lately, Islam does have very quick, hard strikes in the counter-striking, and he could potentially finish this fight as well. You know, all it takes is one punch from either one of these guys to end the fight, and either guy is live to do that. So anyway, that concludes this video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below and who you picked to win this fight, and I'll see you in the next one.